All right, hello everyone. So today we are doing water of life and liquid bread. That roughly means alcohol. Alcohol, both in its essence of what it is, what it means to us culturally, historically, and ultimately, sort of metaphorically. And hopefully, we can use some of that information as we move along to start applying to some of the texts we've looked at, the texts we will be looking at, and the like. So let's jump into it, shall we? First thing that we talk about, of course, is alcohol. What is it? Um, Alcohol, in terms of our use as human beings, kind of breaks down into four major types, but it's also just a chemical process, right? That's something to remember that when we get into, like, fancy words like wort and fermentation and coopering and all this stuff. At its core, we're still just dealing with science. It's just a chemical reaction, and that's the one right there. Glucose, which breaks down into ethanol and to carbon dioxide. The ethanol is the alcohol that we're most interested in, at least in the terms of what we're talking about in terms of food and culture and thought and the like, right? Ethanol is the scientific term for the alcohol that we have in all of everything that we drink. So whether it be wine, be beer, be rum, be whiskey, whatnot, that's the stuff that we're drinking, right? We're drinking ethanol. All the other stuff, yeah, that often gets labeled as alcohol are also have their own places in our world, but it's nothing we're going to be looking at. Methanol, you can see up there, is essentially it's antifreeze. That's where you get to come across. It's a solvent. It comes in certain industrial uses as well. Propanol it's used in medication, often used for heart tremors, hypertension, heart attacks. So people might take that there. The other one that probably you have in your house somewhere along the line is the isopropyl alcohol. It's solvent, cleaning fluid as well, but that's the rubbing alcohol. That's the one that you have in your bathroom that you use when you get a cut. But for us, in the context of this course, in the context talking about food, both as actual thing that we consume and it affects our bodies as well as something that affects our minds and as well as some sort of metaphor for how we view the world in connection to literature and writing and the arts, it is the ethanol that we're looking at, right? So what is ethanol? What is the alcohol that we love? Well, all alcohol is, um, at its core, is just some sugar, some source of sugar that's interacted with yeast, and then bingo, bango, bongo, through the magic of chemistry, we have ethanol, right? The picture that you see up there, that's the chemical breakdown, but that's what yeast looks like. Yeast is a single-celled microorganism. It exists in the air around you. Yes, it also exists in certain products. Yes, you can go buy it. Probably more commonly known as brewer's yeast or baker's yeast. You can throw things, it's what helps create things like breads and the like. But it's also important to remember that the the yeast, this thing that just exists in the world, is what is causing the alcohol, right? At its core, what we do is we just take a sugar source. Now, that sugar source can be virtually anything. When we're talking here, it doesn't have, when we think about sugar, it doesn't actually have to be sweet in the way that we think of it. It just needs to be sugars of some kind. So that this can be something along the lines of grapes, so like a fruit or fruits. We think about wine. It can be grains that have inside them sugars, especially if you mash them down. It can be honey, and then we start dealing with meat. It can be rice. We get into the whole world of sake and things like that. So you just take something that has some sugar in it, right? And then you just let it break down a little bit. Now you can speed that up in different ways, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about different types of alcohol. But you just let it break down. Just think of fruit going rotten, all right? Because that's what rotten fruit is, right? it is fermenting, and that fermentation, that process of fermentation, is the production of alcohol, right? So you let it break down a little bit, those sugars start moving around a little bit, and then it interacts with this microorganism that exists out in the air. And when you let it interact for long enough, that interaction and that reaction creates three things. You get CO2, carbon dioxide, which is present if you, that's just the bubbling that you would see in a liquid, and the energy that comes up associated with it, and the new product, the new substance, which would be ethanol. Now, if it's a very simple chemical process, well, simple in the sense for us that we can reproduce it at any time that we want, right? You don't need really fancy equipment or high-tech expertise to create alcohol. You know, there's a reason why it's been around for so long. There's a reason why it can even be produced in prisons, right? You don't need high technology to create it, right? It is just a matter of waiting for that magic little thing, the yeast, to do their work. And it's very easy to also understand why this thing, this alcohol, would tie itself so fundamentally to our cultures, and especially to our mythologies and to our metaphors. Well, imagine back in the day, you know, when early days, where we know that there's yeast is in the air, and you would have, and if you took some sort of natural occurring sugar source, be it, you know, some sort of fruit or berry or something like that. Like, say you mashed it down, or maybe into like sort of juice type of thing, and you just left it out. Like literally, you just left it out in a vessel overnight for a couple of nights, and then you come back and you after a few days, and you notice that there's this weird foam on the top of it, and it's starting to bubble, and it's like air, and it's starting to like be released, these air shoots of it, like, you know, which is essentially the CO2 coming out, and it smells different. And then if you were to drink it, you'd have the feeling of intoxication. You would, you know, it would be very easy for someone to believe that they are being affected by spirits, right? It is no surprise that many of our stronger alcohols are referred to as spirits, right? It's also interesting to think of that same root word of spirit as both a thing that you drink, a non-physical entity that exists outside of us, also has its connection to the word inspirar, like inspire, which literally to breathe into. But what is breath is air, and that was the spirit is. The spirit is the realm of air. So who are inspired? Well, who are inspired invariably are, you know, the artists, the poets, the writers, the painters, the sculptors. These people are inspired, but so is everyone. So you have this ability to take in this thing and be inspired in a way by this spirit of alcohol, right? Again, not a huge shock to see how this type of thing ties itself so fundamentally to many mythologies. So let's do it. Let's have a look at alcohol. Let's have a look at myth. Let's have a look at the myth making that's associated with it. Obviously, we do not have the time or the space to go through every single associated idea or mythological figure or heroic figure that has alcohol tied into their name. But there are certain ones that pop up that are particularly interesting, right? One of the original ones that draws our attention is back to the origins and to the roots of our civilization in the West, which comes from the Near East, you know, from Sumeria. All right. Here we're talking about the goddess Ninkasi. Ninkasi was, in fact, the goddess of beer. In some cases, interpret her as just being the goddess of alcohol. But she was created, as born, in order to be the healer of one of the great 8 wounds that one of the elder gods was supposed to receive. She was as they said, born of sparkling fresh water. She was the goddess that was made to satisfy the desire and sate the heart. All of these things tie very much into our many people's appreciation and understanding of what alcohol is. Now, beyond just being what she produced, how do we know about this? Not simply because this goddess has still survived the test of time. We still have cults to her today. No, much more so. She is tied into some of the earliest forms of writing that we have found. Sumerian written language, as preserved in clay tablets, were seen as and are seen as some of the earliest forms of human writings. Scholarly works have discovered this, and one of these works that they have found was this poem that is referred to as the Hymn to Ninkasi. This poem is equal parts prayer to the goddess as it is actual recipe for brewing beer. Pretty spectacular. Think back to what we looked at, like Water for Chocolate, right? Equal parts recipe book as it was tale of love, right? So things can be more than one thing, much as alcohol can be more than one thing. We've just seen earlier how alcohol as a name implies everything from the stuff that we drink to the stuff that we use to clean out our cuts as to the stuff that we use to clean our floors with, right? Ninkasi, obviously carrying a major place in the origins of our civilization. We can't, if we move forward a little bit in time, we cannot help but touch on the god Dionysus. Dionysus, of course, the god of wine, the god of intoxication, the god of the frenzy that is associated with that intoxication as well. Dionysus, appears at many points during the Greek myth cycle. He's the one that was able to bring Hephaestus back after he had imprisoned Hera, and of course, how is he able to do so? Well, he's able to take this craftsman of the gods that was so wily and get him drunk and then sling him over the top of his ass and carry him back. He is also twice born, right? He was reborn. He was reborn out of Zeus's thigh because apparently he was, once again, Hera was a little bit upset with his mother, right? He is seen in this way, of course, as being associated with resurrection. So it's not much of a stretch to see his immediate connotation and connection with other resurrected gods, right? Looking into the past, the resurrected god of the Egyptians, that being Osiris, who was also associated with alcohol as one of his the areas under his control, and moving forward into probably the most prominent resurrected God that we think of, and that being of the God of Jesus and his position in that mythology, right? Important to remember as well what do we do when we go to church? Well, we consume. That's right, the blood of Christ. So, of course, we're not actually consuming the blood of Christ, we're drinking wine. Jesus himself also famously turned water to wine, right? So Dionysus and his presence, of course, ties us into the importance and the centrality of wine and alcohol to our civilizations, right? Now, wine itself or alcohol itself, reappears at various points in our history. It also reappears at various points in our culture. The notion of referring to it as spirits. If we even move ourselves into a more quote unquote rational era, into the areas of the Enlightenment, and you'll see a little picture there at the bottom where we referring to, of course, absinthe, right? Here, this stuff here, absinthe, is of course, an alcohol originally made from wormwood, had certain psychoactive attributes. But one of the things that were often associated with absinthe was the presence of the green fairy. The green fairy, of course, would be this mystical creature that would appear to you when you're drinking absinthe, bringing truth and bringing inspiration, because as many of the bohemians that were drinking it would have been seeking inspiration for their artistic endeavors, right? But it's not just drinking your pain away anymore. What we're talking about is engaging in a dialogue or engaging in a communal relationship with the alcohol that has its origins back to early civilizations. But what of early civilization? Without talking about the mythology, without getting all woo-woo about it, what about the flat-out facts? Well, the flat-out facts are these: that odds are we've been drinking alcohol in a controlled way for some way or another since around 7000 BCE. All right, evidence in China has found that the use of berries, honey, and rice being used to create alcoholic beverages, probably around the same time as barley beer being used in the Near East, as well as grape wine being produced in the Middle East, right? Our first real flat-out evidence happens around 5400 BCE in what is now Iran, right? Even, you know, our ancient Egyptian civilization has the presence of alcohol. We know that alcohol was used. We know Egypt, 3150 BCE. There are records that there were at least 17 different types of beer and 24 different types of wine being produced and served at this time. This is better than you get at a lot of pubs nowadays. You know, beer was seen as the drink of laborers. There was a ration that was applied to laborers, right? So alcohol has been with us since the beginning. It's been with us since the beginning, but things got a little bit more interesting into around the Middle Ages, right? The process of distillation started to make its way from the Middle East, where it was likely invented around the 9th century, but it makes its appearance into Italy around the 12th century, right? Now, of course, the idea of distillation is what leads us to a lot of wonderful things, both, purifying liquids and also eventually allowing us to have different forms of alcohol. The further development of this process of distillation from the 12th to the 15th century led to the prominence of substances that, from various names, started to be referred to as life water of some kind or another. So from here we see whiskey, the Gaelic oisci beta, which means water of life, the eau de vie of the French, the agua de vida of the in Latin, right? So this notion that we are drinking now this distilled form of water that is connected to life. The presence of this is, besides the flat out, use in creating alcohol, was also an aid in maintaining civilization and essentially aiding us in not falling prey to many of the waterborne diseases that would have been present at the time, right? Here I'm talking about things like cholera or the like, not just the alcohol, because likely the beers and stuff that were being produced at this time are very, very weak by our standards. If nowadays we think of a weak beer in the 3% range, there most of our beer would have been, people would have been drinking around 1%. So if we hear about people drinking a gallon of beer or a day or something like that back in the medieval times, this is not to say that these people were raving alcoholics. It was just fact that the beer that they were drinking is much weaker. But what this production of alcohol did in the boiling process and the yeast to create it is what essentially purified the water, which stopped the spread of disease, which is why people tend to drink more alcohol or beer very often than they did water, because it was just flat out safer and, dare I say it, better for them. Interesting things started to happen after the Renaissance and into what's called the Enlightenment. Europe itself started to move away from being what could be referred to as a depressant culture and into what could be called a stimulant culture, right? What this essentially means is that we stopped drinking so much alcohol, at least earlier. You know, it was before it was not uncommon for people to be, waking up and drinking wine or beer. Um, but as trade opened up, we started drinking things like tea, which is more of a stimulant, and alcohol was relegated more to either cultural events or religious events, or just as a way of unwinding and relaxing. The notion of drunkenness and or intoxication was often inconsistent with this emerging emphasis of the rational human being, right? So as we became more rational, more secular, we started to think of ourselves as essentially brains that are housed in these bodies and are wandering around. And the notion of being drunk, of consuming these spirits, which invariably very much puts you in your body. You do not have high-level intellectual conversations with drunk people, right? So this started to be put at odds on a cultural level. It also began to be put at odds in a sort of governmental and legal level, right? Probably the most significant example of this, one that you can see in the picture, happened in between the years 1920 to 1933 in the United States, right? The Volstead Act, which was the beginnings of prohibition. We also felt that here in Canada a little bit before in certain provinces, but the interesting thing about this, of course, as many people point out, is that in our prohibition of alcohol, because of its qualities and its effects that were inconsistent with our values and we ended up creating a lot of other problems. One of the most prominent was many people draw the connection between the creation of prohibition and the creation of organized crime, because people didn't stop drinking; they just found different ways to get it. Other things that affected as well, of course, is the tax revenue that the government lost through each year of not selling alcohol. Interestingly enough, that's tax revenue that the government very likely would have needed starting around the year 1929 when the Great Depression hit. Obvious parallels can be made between our own current situation with that as well. So when we say alcohol, what are we talking about? The big ones that pop to mind are the ones we're going to touch on first. First one, as its name ties so deeply into the name of alcohol, whiskey. Whiskey from the Gaelic uisge, right, which just means water, from its classical Gaelic uisge beta, water of life, right? Whiskey, which just is in terms of dictionary definitions, a distilled alcoholic beverage made from fermented grain mash, right? And the varieties of the grain that we are using to create that mash it creates many of the varietals of whiskey that we know. The spelling of whiskey, the one that I've used here, is the spelling of whiskey as it's used in Ireland and the United States. Whiskey without the E is the way it is spelled in most other whiskey producing countries. The major differences, of course, referring to Scotch, which always refers to Scotch whiskey, right? So what's whiskey? How do you make it? Again, this is not a how-to class, but it is a basic overview, and it points out both the universal nature of the production and the essential nature of the production of alcohol, because it can just happen, and also into its tying into our own sort of sociological and cultural history, right? Whiskey making basically breaks down into 5 or 6 steps, right? There's preparation, wherein you are essentially assembling the grains that you are that you're going to be using. Barley being probably one of the most prominent ones, right? You know, so after you've prepared them, you know, there we are as the assembly of the, you know, after growing them and drying them and the like, we're going to mash them. So what a mash is essentially adding water. You're cooking the grain, grain and malted barley, and adding warm water, which, you know, converts this whole thing into a liquid. This liquid, this sort of gooey, mashed up, you know, grain and malted barley thing, is called a mash. This is the same term that we're going to be seeing through many other productions of alcohol, especially when we look at whiskey, and we'll also look at beer. Once you have a mash, you know, you ferment it. This is where that first example of science comes back in. You know, this is that chemical formula. You're going to stick it into a. Nowadays, we stick it into a tank, but you know, you stick it in there with some yeast. You know, back to when I said, like, alcohol can be converted with the yeast that comes from the air, but the more control you have over all the steps in the production means the more control you have over the finished product. The same as in anything. Think the same as in writing something. The more control you have over every aspect of your writing in terms of your knowledge and reading and writing capabilities and command of the language, all these things lead you to more control over your final product. So the fermenting part, this is where the yeast interacts with the sugar that exists in the mash and the alcohol is produced. You know, this is going to take about, you know, it takes us about 3 or 4 days of sitting around in the tank, and you're going to end up with an alcohol with a liquor of around, you know, 18, 19, 20% alcohol, right? This is referred to as a wash or distiller's beer, right? Then this wash, as it's called, is then put into the next process, which is familiar to us, which is distilling. The wash heated, and then where it turns into the point where it turns to vapor. The water, we get rid of the water this way, and then we collect the alcohol into a second container, and by doing this we are getting a higher alcohol content than the original quote-unquote, you know, distiller's beer or wash, right? We've got whiskey now. This is really, you know, at this point we essentially have whiskey, or they call it high wine or new whiskey or the like. Once it's been distilled, we move into aging. Aging is the part where you take that new whiskey and you put it into wooden barrels. Invariably, these wooden barrels, ideally what's charred white oak, for some reason it seemed to work the best. And this is where you start developing your different ages of your whiskey. After you've aged it from anywhere from 3 to 4 to 10 to 14 years, and it's ready, you bottle it, and then you sell it or you consume it. It's important to note that whiskeys do not mature in the bottle. They do not, or they only mature in the cask. So that time that the whiskey spends in the cask, in those wooden barrels, that's the time that you're seeing the whiskey mature, and that is many of the associated characteristics that come associated with the whiskey that come in there, the particular nuanced smells or tastes that come with it, right? So when we're talking about the age of a whiskey, you go buy a bottle of whiskey, or you're giving a bottle of whiskey and you see that little number, like how old it is, right? That's not how long that bottle's been sitting on the shelf. It's not how long it's been bottled. It's how much time it's spent between the distilling process and the bottling process, how much time it's spent in that cask. The whiskey that you get at the end, right? The fermented grain mash, if you want to call it that, sounds so much less attractive, that you get in the end, and that we think of all the different names that we get associated with. We get Irish whiskey, bourbon, rye, Scotch, Tennessee whiskey, Canadian whiskey. All that stuff depends largely on what it's being made out of, and where you're putting it for that aging process, right? That means, so if you're drinking Irish whiskey, then you are drinking something that is aged in wood casks for at least 3 years and it was made in Ireland. That's what it means. If you're drinking bourbon, it could be a bunch of different things, right? Bourbon in itself just means that the whiskey that you're drinking contains at least 51% corn, right? Means it was aged in oak barrels and made mostly in Kentucky. So that the grain mash for bourbon is made out of corn as opposed to barley, right? So in the bourbon variety, means if you're drinking Jim Beam or if you're drinking Buffalo Trace or something along those lines. However, if you're drinking something called Tennessee whiskey, there's the Jack Daniels, is something that is charcoal filtered bourbon. So there's a specific kind of filtering that's done afterwards, and it's made specifically in Tennessee. If you're drinking something called corn whiskey, which is a variety of bourbon, which means there is at least 80% corn. Depends on what the label will tell you what it is. Rye. Rye whiskey means that at least 51% of the grains that are used to make that whiskey are rye grains. That's it. Canadian whiskey often contains some rye, and meaning it's also aged at least 3 years, and it's also made in Canada. Yeah. The easiest one to remember at all times, of course, is Scotch, simply because Scotch just means Scotch whiskey. It means it's something made from malted barley, and it's made in Scotland. All of them have are going to be aged at least 3 years, and they're gonna have the associated flavors coming out of that. But ultimately, when we talk about grains, while they have their place in the whiskeys and the bourbons and the scotches and all this, of course, the world's oldest and most widely consumed alcoholic drink is beer, which is brewed from grains, most commonly barley, right? Interesting to note, beer actually runs third if we're talking about most popular drinks or most widely consumed drinks in the world, ranking behind number 1 being water and number 2 being tea. It hurts my soul a little bit to say that, knowing that coffee's not in the running, but nonetheless. As I mentioned, early presence of beer in our culture. Remember back when we talked about the Parata Ninkasi, the Mesopotamian tablets where we're talking about beer. It's been with us for a long, long time. If we're talking beer, we're talking two main varieties. Of course, beer connoisseurs will argue this, but essentially for most of us, the common users can break it down to two. There's lagers and there's ales. A lager essentially means cool fermentation. Ale is warm fermentation. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second when I talk about how we make beer. The odd one out in this is what's called lambics. Now, lambics technically are ales. It falls in the ale category, but they're different. Remember, right back in the beginning of the lecture when we talked about where do we get our yeast from? Well, in most lagers and in most ales that are produced in virtually every brewery, our yeast source is injected by the brewmaster. They have decided what yeast works best. They know what yeast works best to make a consistent type of beer, so they're going to use it every time. Lambic beers, lambic beers have a large popularity in a lot of Belgian beers are lambic beers. Lambic beers are ones that work with wild yeasts, meaning that they're being produced with whatever yeasts happen to be living in that region. So it's what makes certain varieties of beer, the lambic ales specifically, have that sort of very distinctive flavor. There's a sort of like a fruity, sort of soury flavor to them as well. That is distinct to that type of beer. comes because of where the yeast comes from, but it leads to a different type of fermentation or a different action in the fermentation, right? Lambics are one of those things that a lot of people just, you love them or you hate them, lightly because of that. But let's touch back on to what we're on how to make beer. Again, unfortunately, not a how-to course, but it's pretty darn easy, right? At its core, we're doing the same thing that we did way back when we were looking at whiskey, when we were just waiting for something to just ferment, right? We're taking and we're making a mash, right? What do? Taking hot water and malt. So you're going to take your barley, it's starting to malt, which means it's starting to germinate, and then you're going to throw hot water in there, and you're going to make it into a mash. You keep it in what's called a mash tun, which is just a big thing of a big tank for 1 to 2 hours. This becomes what's called a wort. The wort, you boil it in what's called a copper. It's called a copper because ideally they're made out of copper. Copper is a great conductor of heat, right? The wort is just the fancy term for the fermentable liquid. Like this is the stuff that we're going to wait and hope to react. That's going to react with the yeast, right? You stick it in your copper, you boil it for about an hour. Your water evaporates, your hops are added if you're adding hops. As we do, more hops that you add, the more bitter the flavor, and the longer they're boiled in, the more bitter the flavor. Hence, if you're thinking things like, IPAs and things like that, have a more hoppier flavor to them, right? Once you got the hopped wort, you cool it, and it's ready to add that yeast. You put that yeast in there and you throw it in the fermenter, and then right here, depending on what yeast you're using, is going to depend on what kind of fermentation is going to happen. Cool fermentation or warm fermentation, depending on the temperature that it takes place at, right? Ales are what's called warm fermentation, happens between 20 to 23 degrees Celsius, right? Lagers happen at a cooler temperature. The fermentation happens at a cooler temperature, 7 to 12 degrees Celsius, right? So, historically, it's fairly easy to say most of our beers used to be ales, right? Because we didn't have, it was harder to keep things cool in order to add those specific kinds of yeasts to interact. Now, it wasn't lagers really sort of took off because of the origins of certain types of lagers, mainly pilsners. Many of the more popular beers in the world nowadays are essentially versions of pilsners. It comes from Germany. Now that those pilsners and the German brewery laws and the purity laws that came in Germany, happened at a time where they could keep things cooler and more controlled. This is also why, a lager has generally a fresher or crisper flavor to it than the ale does. Doesn't make one better than the other. It's all just how that fermentation happens. So you do that. You ferment, and then once you ferment it, some beers will have what's called a primary secondary fermentation. Then you're going to filter it. For some you do, some you don't. And then after you filter it, then you rack it. Rack is just putting it into containers. Now whether that container be casks or kegs or bottles and things like that. And then you bottle and you serve, right? So we're still dealing with the same process, just broken down. And you can see if you walk into any pub or liquor store or beer store, and you see the massive varieties of beer that are available and whiskeys that are available and rums that are available. All of this are just variations on of a theme. We're all using the same basic ingredients. We're using the same grains. Most of the time, many people are using sometimes even the same yeasts, right? It's just when you add it in, how many hops you add, or how long you're aging it, what kind of wood you're using in the aging. All of this variety in it comes from human tinkering, and this is the action of the human artisan playing upon the natural world, much in the same way like when we're talking about writing something, you're reading a novel, you're reading a nonfiction piece. We're still using the same number of letters in the alphabet, right? Very often we're using the same relatively limited vocabulary, but it's how you play with it. It's what you do with what you got that makes art, or not art, as the case may be. So let's leave grains for a second and let's move to straight up sugars, right? Rum. rum is, again, textbook definition, a distilled alcohol made from sugarcane byproducts, usually molasses, or sometimes directly from sugarcane juice, right? So the origin of rum as a etymological term, as a concept, and as a beverage, not really sure. We do know for a fact that that term was in use around the 1650s, right, in common use. Rum, of course, because of what it's made from, molasses or sugarcane juice, has its home more in tropical regions. So where you're dealing with the Caribbean, South America, southern parts of the states. This is rum time. So rum, for the most part, if we're talking about rum, we're talking about a distilled alcoholic beverage that's been made from molasses. A lot of it's being made from molasses, right? That's what gives it that distinctive taste, right? So when we talked about the same process applies. It's still alcohol, right? So the same process of fermentation, distillation, aging. This still happens, where instead of using a grain mash, what we're just using here is molasses as the sugar source, right? Sometimes it's also used just flat out sugar cane juice, though they usually have different names. So South America, in parts of South America, you call them different things. Things like aguardiente, like spicy water, cañazo, coming from cane, cachaça, which is very popular in Brazil. Those are very coming from sugarcane juice as opposed to the molasses. Now, in terms of the creation, what it does, it's the same. You're going to ferment, so you're going to have your sugar source. It's going to ferment. It's going to create your alcohol. It's going to create a lighter form of alcohol. Then you're going to distill that. The distillation, that same process that came into Europe in the 12th century, that existed back in the 8th and 9th century. In the Middle East. That same incredible process of essentially just boiling something off and removing the water from it, right? Happens, and then you age. And again, so many of these processes, it comes into that aging part where the flavor comes in, maturing. There are metaphors here, of course. So many countries that create rum require that rum be aged for at least a year, often in bourbon casks, right? This is what usually determines the color of the rum. It often determines some of the extra flavors, it overtones the rum will have. It's interesting that it doesn't take as long as well, prominently because of where rum's produced, the tropical climates and the like. Rum matures at a higher rate than typical whiskey. Just you can get rid of that water faster. So, look at us, right? Last but not least is wine. Wine, essentially a alcoholic beverage made from grapes, though not always technically from grapes. You can include other sugar sources in there. There are such things as strawberry wine or berry wines, and there's honey wines, which is just called mead. Rice wine at its core is that. But for most of us, when we throw the word wine around, what we are talking about is fermented juice of the grape. The earliest known appearance happened in, as I said, China around 7000 BC, but what we think of it nowadays is not exclusively held in one particular part of the world. We know that wine comes from virtually everywhere because grapes can grow a lot of different places, right? Origins, the name, it's at its core, just comes from grape. Wine likely coming from the Latin vinum, which means wine or grape or vine and the like, right? I've heard wine be, being likened to sort of magic, right? For expressions, play around with this thing, in vino veritas, right? In wine there is truth. That one winemaker famously quipped that the grape was sunlight captured, right? So it's kind of these romantic notions of what it is. But when we think of it, you know, it's a grape, and it's the juice that comes out of it. The red wine that produced come takes its distinctive color from the seeds, no, sorry, the skins of the grape, which is also where the tannin flavors come in. It has nothing to do with the color of grapes you're dealing with it, so you don't need white, green grapes to make white wine. You don't need red grapes to make red wine. It's if you look at grapes, it's the pulp of any grape is always colorless, but it's the skin that's different. So if you're keeping the skins in there, then you're going to get a red wine. If you're not, then you're going to get a white wine. The names of the wines themselves, are so tied in. It's just the name of the grape that's being used. The varietal of the grapes is the name of your wine that you're going to be using. Wine, again, just like all the others, same basic production process, right? But it is far closer tied in with the notions of agriculture, right? Which is where we're going to end off with in a little bit. Wine production breaks itself down to 5 easy steps. There's the harvesting, which is just the picking of the grapes, very often done by hand, just in order not to damage grapes. Then you've got the crushing and the pressing part, where you are crushing that grape, and you're making the pulp, you're making the juice that's going to interact with your yeast, right? Then you're going to have your fermentation. Now, because of the amount of sugar that's naturally present in grapes, if you just left the mashed up grapes there open, odds are within 6 to 12 hours you see fermentation start. But that doesn't happen. Most commercial wine producers, really anyone that's making wine, is going to be using a cultured yeast because they're trying to build a consistency. You want to have as close to a consistent product as you can. So then they're fermenting. Fermentation in wine ends when all the sugar is done. There's a lot of sugar to get rid of. So that, depending on the varietal, depending on the year, depending on a lot of things, that can be anywhere from 10 days to a month of fermentation that takes place. Once you've got a fermented liquid, then then you clarify, which is essentially the filtering, getting rid of the all the little solid bits in there, and then racking. And then once you've racked it and made sure you clarified it all, you're going to age. And this is the same as many other ones. You're aging, which is done in casks. For some reason, oak seems to be the one that works the best with everything. So the oak casks are the ones where you're going to keep that wine in there for as long as the winemaker believes is necessary. And therein lies the art of it, right? Therein lies the art of, like, how long do you keep it in there? How long do you age it? This is where it deviates from science. Like, with the science is there behind it, but the science is the pen. What you do with that pen is the art. And why is that the case? As anybody that is interested in wine or remotely interested in wine will tell you, wine has this sort of quasi-mystical quality that is often referred to as just what they call terroir, right? Which is just, can be translated as just territory, right? But it's so much more. The flavor and the taste of a wine takes on everything that is around it, right? And this is where we find its deepest connection and deepest parallel to things like literature, right? What you read when you read a piece of literature is very much part of all of the influences that came around that author, came around the time of that publishing, came around you when you're consuming it, right? All of that is to take into effect. For wine, the terroir usually is broken down into about 4 points. There's the climate, meaning, what's the weather like? Different kinds of grapes, different types of climate produce different types of effect on the grapes, which will therefore produce different types of effect on the wine. What kind of soil are we dealing with? What nutrients are in that soil? something that's called geomorphology, so meaning the nature and form of the land around it physically. You know, hills, not hills, how much shade, not enough shade, sunlight, all that stuff plays into it. Plants, other plants that are going around in and around that area. You know, what other plants are growing in that same field or close to that field, because that's going to tie into the flavors that you're going to taste when you get in dealing with wine. And in addition to this, the terroir, there's of course the human controlled elements in each wine production, right? Somebody decided what to plant. Someone decided when to plant it. Someone decided when to harvest it. Someone decided what yeast to use, right? All these things in this magical cauldron kind of bubble together and create wine and the specific taste. All right? This is why people get obsessive over it. But like I said, it's so much like we think of when we think of literature or writing. It's not just that some guy or some girl happened to throw paper down and then scribble some stuff on it. You know, things happened before it. You know, who are they? What did they read? What did they experience? What was going on in the society around them? What was important in the culture around them at that time? Oh, wow. All of these things filter in to our reading and our appreciation of a piece of literature, much in the same way as you read. Who you are when you read something is just as important as who that author was, right? And the way you understand something, if you read, we said like water for chocolate, as we did a few weeks ago, right? If you read like water for chocolate now, and you reread that same book a decade from now, it will not be the same book. It will not be the same appreciation because you're not the same person. So how could that appreciation or that interaction with that text be the same, right? Let's never discount the importance of the person consuming the product, right? We may live ourselves in a consumer culture and think of ourselves as passive, but in the ultimate end, we are the ones that are the final judge, jury, and executioner of our appreciations. And judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to whether it be something that we put into our mouths or into our minds.